Hi listeners, I'm Izzy, my pronouns are they and them. Welcome to the Critical Conversations for Social Work podcast. This is Joella.
Before we start, we'd like to acknowledge the country that we're recording this episode on today and pay our respects to the Turrbal and Yagara peoples and their elders, past, present and emerging, by committing to always remembering that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Something that the first group of students who worked on this project, they discussed what the values governing this project would be, and what they identified as values were things like critical thinking and reflection. So that passion about providing alternative perspectives to social work practice through creative and critical pedagogy. Around accessibility for the podcast.
The podcast will have transcripts created and released alongside them, as I myself struggle with hearing on podcasts, particularly new big words. And so that was also part of the research group as well, to release definitions alongside a transcript so everyone has access to the knowledge.
The other was around diversity and inclusivity. So valuing people, including the cultural, gender and educational backgrounds they come from, and the knowledges they bring that are often marginalised through other disciplines. And that's really central to what we do as social work.
Part of the critical pedagogy for me throughout the whole thing was bringing these big academic words down to normal level.
There is that many terms in critical pedagogy that can leave you befuzzled.
That's a good word.
And yeah,
Do we need to break that?
those pre-interviews which led into the part Bs were definitely a big part of it. So we would meet with the person who was going to talk with Jean, and we'd talk for an hour at least or more about what's your interpretation of it, but also the group's also been researching, listening to it, so they want to give you their interpretation of it, make with it what you will, but want to make sure that everyone's involved in it, and just getting that sort of, we've all got our own worldviews, diverse opinions, and making sure everyone's getting a say with it. So I thought those pre-interviews were really helpful.
Yeah, and really inclusive. Everyone had a voice in that. It was really important.
Yeah, I found that there were often things that came up in the pre-interviews that I definitely wouldn't have thought of myself, and so it was really beneficial, I think, to have everyone's perspectives coming to those, because it just gave us so much diversity in the perspectives we were getting.
So how we're planning on releasing the episodes loosely is coming out, I think, once a fortnight, and it'll be dropped in a Part A and a Part B section. The Part A section was with the last group students who were on placement, and they were interviewing people who use critical and creative pedagogies in their work. And then we have the Part B episodes, which are a response to that, and sort of in the ilk of critical pedagogy, kind of really try to break down those themes and terms. A bit more of an informal conversation between someone who's interested in the field, but not necessarily a professional. Jean doesn't really dictate that conversation, it just kind of goes where the person wants it to go.
Absolutely. So it kind of flows, and sometimes we had conversations where two people were involved, and that might be a student or a former student, someone who practices in social work and human services. So
I think adding on that, critical pedagogy matters for social work practice because as it's concerned, it quite often looks at the experiences of oppressed people and people who don't have the power, and it finds ways to work with them around the knowledges they have.
Importantly, is privileging Indigenous voices rather than the mainstream dominant white theories that underpin social work practice today.
Our opportunity to influence and advocate and also engage in activism is just so crucial.
I think capturing the values about what critical social work is about, but how do we bring those to education and how do we make a difference in the way that we do that?
And I think that when it comes to sort of relating things back to how does this help us as social work practitioners and how we've learnt from this placement, being able to take a step back and consider all the options and maybe think outside the box a bit is such a useful and important thing to be able to do.
Similarly, the social worker then isn't the one imposing interventions, but that actually comes in partnership with the people we work with.
Every day we've got an opportunity to influence and advocate and use our activist approaches, and especially when we're working in organisations or government departments.
That's so true. It doesn't really the people in power, like we still have our own power that we can bring to this area, and we still have the ability to advocate and bring our own values and critically question things.
That's it.
Important to really think about and consider the ways that we could be part of that force for social control, or we could be part of the change so that we don't do that to people. And so we're shifting those neoliberal rules around conditioning and providing something that is more collaborative, creates that collaborative alliance, creates a more critical pedagogy where we see the wisdom in the shared knowledge that comes from everyone. One of Christine's quotes is that the main goal in supporting global capitalism is to shut down our ability to think and critique.
And you can see how that is a failing of neoliberalism, because it doesn't give space for complexity, and it isn't able to extend past baseline profit, and it becomes about budgets, and it becomes about meeting targets and all of those kinds of things.
And critical approaches give us something different. They give us chances to be hopeful and not to be zombies, but to be active and conscious and engaged and come together instead of just being individual.
Integrate animals into everyday practices to normalise it. And I think that's also something that could be in schools, in education system.
At the heart of social work is social justice. So what does that mean? Does that say only human justice? Social justice. And I really want to say, it's a simple point, but we're social workers. And the social world has lots of components. It's not just psychological or interpersonal. It's structural, it's systemic, it's cultural. It's all of those dimensions, and it involves relationships between humans and animals.
It's not that me, the community development worker, or me, the facilitator, tells people what is true. We create the conditions and the stimulus for dialogue. But what's important from community development perspective is this pedagogy has to be collectives in dialogue.
Coming in and being on the same level and just listening.
Queer theory helped me understand the discourses that lay behind those injustices. And so
what we can do to create change, and she mentions becoming a citizen that contributes to a radically just and democratic world through social activism, which Claire just spoke to, for a more socially just society. Develop a community of learning and have critical conversations in your own circles.
I think what critical pedagogy can do is, I hope, give students and practitioners alternative ways to understand disadvantage, alternative ways to understand the ways that capitalism produces poverty. People don't produce poverty.
And it's also really exciting because then we don't have to have all the answers going in.
An outcome of that meeting was that we started having dialogues. We started having conversations. And that was really helpful because homelessness can be gendered in different ways. And so boarding houses may be more a not desired option, but an option for men, whereas women, it might be domestic and family violence.
Absolutely. Way of moving out the unseemly characters, people coming out of prison.
Assumedly, unseemingly. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely, allegedly.
To think queerly is to really think, and so queer theory helps us to challenge normativity, to ask bigger questions about why do we assume that everyone's cisgendered or heterosexual, and what happens if we don't assume that? What could the world be like if we didn't assume that? And so not just about how to work better with queer communities. Queer theory helps us to challenge normativity.
I was still part of the process, but I didn't have to lead.
Taking the ecosystems out of these areas and making them a dead zone.
So it brings it into that idea of capitalism and how capitalism and the overconsumption and
the idea that no discipline is value free, and that includes social work.
Indigenous pedagogy, I think, is really important.
And we actually had a conversation, didn't we, about the difference between activism and advocacy?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so activism is when you're actually doing something that is more than just walking alongside a person to create change in their life. You're actually doing it for social change in the broader systems and structures of society. And so making sure that
including the cultural, gender and educational backgrounds they come from and the knowledges they bring that are often marginalised through other disciplines. And
of course we're all biased, but it's often only more left-wing or socially justice orientated perspectives that get considered as biased, and things that are the status quo are just assumed to be natural and normal. And
positioning ourselves to critically reflect as well. I think the aspect of being critical is really important as well, and that comes through from the way Deb talks about reflection. And I suppose it is important because these stereotypes and assumptions that we might have as students or emerging practitioners are more often than not unconscious as well, and we may not realise that until we do that critical reflection. And
as neoliberal zombies, where we know what we're supposed to do and then we just follow it. We don't actually know why we're doing this thing that we're supposed to be doing. And there's very little hope. There's very little idea of transformation or social change.
We assume that we already know the answer and we don't have to raise it. Education is always driven by values or an ethos, and to recognise that education is political in the broadest sense.
It allows us to have conversations that mainstream education might not give us. It allows us to think about what's possible and
health or disability and things like that. And so often animals are used as a comforting a comforting companion for people in those situations. And sometimes animals are trained intentionally for those purposes, in the same way that animals would be trained to work with blind people, for example, and those sorts of things. And so that's kind of a real growing thing in social work. Like Heather talks about, you don't have a social work role where you just work with animals.
Yeah, it's not a critical animal role, is it?
No.
Even though that would be the dream.
No, that's right. That's right. And so really recognising the importance and the value of those animals having rights within that, within those spaces.
Interestingly enough, pioneered, developed mostly by Lena Dominelli and others. They don't really touch human-animal relationships. And my guess is because they're meat and dairy eaters. Often it comes down to that simple. It's that simple. People don't, and I understand that. I came from that past. So what happens is then there's a huge piece that's missing in climate change, like we saw at the Glasgow conference, and our deputy leader, Barnaby Joyce, wanting to excise methane from the carbon emissions. And methane's largely associated with gas production, but also livestock, so-called.
Yes. Yeah. So we're doing a technique instead of thinking about the ways that we might approach a situation.
For the social work profession, I think the risk of becoming that foot soldier is where we're reduced to a form of social control. And I think there are soft ways of shaping that, of being that foot soldier. And I think there's the hard end of that too. So some of those soft forms of social control can be, for example, through the counselling process, where you might engage in ways of being with the clients that are about shaping their behaviour.
And what sort of education would befit both what we live in and what we would like to see?
So Educated Hope contests the assumption that existing social structures cannot be challenged and enables students and practitioners to envision alternative ways of living and organising society.
Centering marginalised voices and disrupting some of those typical notions of power.
That's so true. It doesn't really the people in power, like we still have our own power that we can bring to this area, and we still have the ability to advocate and bring our own values and critically question things.
That's it.
The ideas of how we as practitioners or future practitioners can be involved not only in the critique, and so this comes from Giraud, so the idea of educated hope, being involved in critique, but the creation of conceptual space to imagine alternative futures, and that might lead to social transformation.
If you'd like to keep up with any of our socials and to continue listening to future episodes, please follow us on Instagram. That's Critical Conversations, 4 SW. That's a bit of a mouthful, but yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.